And we'll take all the credit for that. Oh, okay, that's good. I did not, but I like it. But I like yours better. Thanks, Judy. And thank you guys for really venturing out on such a difficult night. And hopefully that I will make it worth your while. And if you have any questions at any time during this talk, just shout them out, and I'll try to deal with them. Makes it more interesting, I think, for everybody that way. The Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary is one of the 13 federally designated marine protected areas in the United States. We're just off the coast of Massachusetts, so it's one that's near and dear to all of our hearts in this room, I'm sure. I'm going to get the official pointer here. High tech and low tech. These things always work. And I'll try to see. Okay, there's really three main issues that we try to deal with at the Stellwagen Sanctuary these days with reference to baleen whale conservation. And the first one is entanglement in commercial fishing gear. As most of you know, that's a big issue for right whales, but it's really a big issue for all the baleen whales and also some of the smaller cetaceans as well. The second one is ship strikes that we're going to touch upon, and that's, again, a very hot topic for right whales, but again, for all of the large whales, lesser so for the small critters. And then acoustics and disturbance is the last one we're going to talk about, and that's really a chronic and really ubiquitous issue that's just coming to the forefront. So how large a problem it is isn't really known right now. Some of us suspect it could be quite large. Other people think that it's not such a big deal at all. So it's one that we're going to have to be dealing with scientifically, if not in a policy context, fairly soon. Huh. It's not supposed to do that. Went right to the end. Oh, so thank you for coming. It was a great talk. Take two. A minute, I put my glasses on to work better. There we go. So the first one we're going to talk about again is entanglement. And what you're looking here, of course, the coast of Massachusetts. And this little box that you're going to be seeing a lot of, there it is the boundary of the Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary. It's an area about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's a sanctuary, but it's a very interesting one, just to before you start asking that question, which is that there's all sorts of activity that's allowed in it. So there's all sorts of commercial fishing that goes on there. There's transportation, marine transportation that goes through there. Just about any marine activity that occurs will occur in the sanctuary. So it is a federally designated marine protected area, but what it's protected from is sometimes a bit puzzling, even to those of us that work there. What you're seeing here, all these dots, are the sites where large baleen whales have been sighted entangled. And you see a lot of these dots are right inside the sanctuary. So for us, this is really an issue that we have to try to struggle with, both from a science perspective and also for a policy perspective. The two main gears are going to be gill nets. And gill nets, a lot of you are probably familiar with. They look kind of like a tennis net that's stretched across the bottom of the ocean. These are sitting up maybe 12 to 14 feet. Each net is maybe 100 yards long, and they can be strung 20 or so nets in a line. So a lot of this gear can be stretched along the bottom. Then there's a line that goes to the surface that goes to these surface buoys, which are used to haul the gear. And this, of course, is an entanglement threat as well as the nets themselves. Lobster gear, again, there's a buoy on the surface. You guys know the lobster buoys. They go down here to the traps. And then there's a series of traps usually put together into a trawl, maybe 20 traps in a trawl. And one of the issues here is that the line between the traps floats up in the water column. There it is. And whales can get entangled in that line that floats up between the traps. So those are the two main fixed gear issues in the sanctuary. Now, if you're going to try to deal with entanglement, one of the things that's nice to know is where whales and gear might co-occur, because that's where your highest risk is going to occur. So to do that as a sanctuary, we undertook a series of standardized surveys, and basically what we did is we drove the sanctuary. Where is this? Fine. How can I not be seeing that? There we go. We had a series of tracks that crossed the sanctuary, and we drove these every month, and we counted everything that was out there: whales, fishing gear, boats, you name it. If it moved out there, or even if it didn't move, we counted it and then tried to map it. So this would give us a good idea of where different things occurred, and then when we mapped them together, therefore where they co-occurred. So this is some of the whale stuff that we found. Each dot that you're seeing here is where a baleen whale is sighted. And so the big areas were the southern portion of the bank, the northwest portion of the bank right here, and then up top along Jeffrey's Ledge. There we go. I'll have this by the end. There you go, from Jeffrey's Ledge. So those are going to be the main hotspots for where baleen whales occur, at least in the years that we did the survey. This one is 2001 and 2002. We did it earlier in 94 and 95 as well. So that gave us some idea of where whales might be occurring. Then we were also, of course, counting fishing gear. So the dots that you're seeing on this map are where surface buoys were located. You know, a lobster buoy that was sitting on the surface, a gillnet buoy that was sitting on the surface. And of course, each two of those buoys have those thousands of feet or meters of gear along the bottom between them. Then the triangles, gillnet boats are the red triangles, and lobster boats are the yellow squares. So it gives you an idea that there's a lot of activity going on out there. So if we then try to look for co-occurrence, we did here, it's all the buoys are in green, the whale sightings are in red, and we use a really simple metric of just multiplying the number of whales times the number of buoys in a block. And that sounds really rather simplistic, but it is really kind of powerful, because if there's a lot of whales and no gear, it returns a 0. If there's a lot of, a lot of gear and no whales, it returns a 0. But if there's a lot of both, then it returns a very high number. So we used that nice little metric, and then we just gridded the sanctuary off into blocks, and these are the top, into quartiles. So the top risk areas are going to be in black here, and that's really just where a lot of gear and a lot of whales co-occur. So then we made a prediction, obviously, that this is where a lot of entanglements might occur. So during the same period, with a year on either side, these yellow dots are where we sighted entangled whales. This is the royal we, whale watching boats, fishermen, research groups, everybody that's out there looking. This is where entangled whales were sighted. So you can see there's a fairly good concurrence between where we predicted entanglements would occur and where they actually occurred, particularly this real hot spot right here. This is this block here. So you can see that's really astronomical in terms of risk from the rest of the sanctuary, and it's borne out by the number of animals that are seen entangled there. Now, that sounds better than it might be, because one of the problems when you're dealing with entanglement, particularly with large whales, is that a whale can tow gear long ways, thousands of miles, from the site of original entanglement. So you might not see it where it originally became entangled, or you might see it the same day it became entangled. Or animals might become entangled in the sanctuary and swim away and be sighted in Newfoundland almost. So there's a real problem sometimes with how these data are used. So we have to interpret them cautiously, but we can see that there's certainly a fairly good correlation between where we predict whales to become entangled in the sanctuary and where they seem to be sighted at least. So this is the line that's floating between lobster traps. That big area that you're seeing was mostly an area where the lobster fishery is very highly concentrated. And again, if you could imagine all these lines that are then floating up through the water column, crisscrossing each other and making a bit of a mess out there for whales to try to navigate. So if we're going to try to reduce, and these are just some of the entangled whales cited by the Center for Coastal Studies. One of the things you might be able to do is take that gear from floating up in the water column and sink it down and lie it on the bottom. And that's going to reduce the risk, some unknown amount, but some degree, because the animals aren't going to encounter it as frequently. But to convince people to make that shift isn't always easy, because people like to do what they've always done. So one of the things that we've been doing in conjunction with folks here at Hui, and I think that, I'm not sure if Judy said that I'm a guest investigator here or not, but I work a lot with the Hui community. And one of the things we've been trying to do is convince fishermen and regulators that they need to sink that line along the bottom for conservation means. And one of the things we've been doing to try to convince people of that is using this particular piece of equipment here, which is the D-tag, invented by Mark Johnson and Peter Tyak here at Hui. This is really a revolutionary piece of equipment. It's a tag that goes on the whales. It is applied with suction cups, and that's what sticks it on, so it's totally benign. And it creates a huge amount of data in a small period of time. So the attachment is a suction cup. It weighs only about 200 grams in water, so it's fairly light when you put it on the animal. The sampling rate, pitch, roll, and heading, about 50 times a second, so it's getting huge amounts of data on very fine scale. We then subsample it down to about 2 times a second to make it more manageable. And it also is sampling the acoustics at the same time. So using that, we know what the animal's doing in terms of pitch, roll, and heading, and what it's hearing, and what sounds it's making, all at the same time. So it's extremely powerful. Now, because it's taking huge amounts of data in, it fills itself up after about 20 hours, at least the present version does. So it gives a lot of fine-scaled information for a relatively short period of time, about 20 hours. How does sinking the gear affect the fishing? That's a good question. It wouldn't affect their catch, at least it doesn't seem to, but the big reticence on the part of the fishing industry is that if they're in rocky areas, that line that's floating up above the rocks doesn't have a tendency to get tangled in the rocks and make it hard to pull your gear. Where if you sink it along the bottom, then it might have a tendency to fall into the nooks and the crannies of the rocks and make it harder to pull out. It really depends on what fishermen you're talking to, actually. When I was doing a lot of gear research, I would go to fishermen's meetings and meet with like 20 or 30 of these guys at the time and try to talk to them about whale conservation and what was going on from the whale point of view. And then, of course, they'd tell me what was going on from the fishing point of view. And at this one particular meeting, one of the fishermen was just lambasting me for the fact that I would have the audacity to say that they needed to sink their line because they couldn't live without floating line. And so I said, absolutely, I understand what you're talking about. And most of these meetings were at bars, so at the end, we stayed around. I had a couple of beers, and at the end of the night, this other guy comes up to me and he goes, what you were talking about, that need to sink the line, that's really the key. And I said, yeah, I know, but the guys can't really fish without floating line. And he said, well, that's what some people would tell you. And so I said, well, what would other people tell me? And he goes, well, I don't use sinking or floating line. I've used sinking line my entire career. He was a gentleman, maybe 60 years old or so. And I said, yeah, but you obviously don't fish where this guy fishes. And I pointed to the guy that was really lambasting me, for lack of a better term. And he said, well, that's my neighbor. And we not only live next to each other, but we fish next to each other. I said, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Why don't you use floating line? He said, well, because I hate the sound of floating line in the holler. And so I'd rather use sinking line because it's quieter. So here you had one guy that absolutely had to use it because he couldn't fish without it. And then his neighbor doesn't use it just because he doesn't like the sound of it in the holler. And he said, if you had to listen to that whine day after day after day for 40 years, you wouldn't like it either. And I said, well, okay, I can believe you. But again, that's one of the problems sometimes is that one person is sure they absolutely can't live without, one person doesn't think they need it all. And that's always one of the challenges when you're working with the fishing community or loggers or any other community that has a lot of really good hands-on experience, but don't necessarily experiment with other ways to do things. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but yes? The D-tag, I'll show you a little clip here in a second, but it has to be recovered. So when it comes off an animal, when the D-tag comes off an animal, it'll float to the surface, and we actually have to get the tag, bring it back, and download it. Which, luckily, we haven't lost a single one of these in 3 years. And I shouldn't say that because this year I'm sure that we'll lose all of them. But this is the procedure of putting it on. The tag is on the tip of the pole. This is Alex Shorter, who used to be an engineer here at Hui. So we're going to be cruising up next to this animal. Now there's a prop guard on, so we're approaching quite carefully. There's a prop guard to protect the animals from any propeller injuries. And of course, we try to be as careful as possible for 2 reasons. One, for animal welfare issues. I'm a total Bambi when it comes to this stuff. And there goes the tag on. But also from a scientific perspective, because the tag's really only staying on for 20 hours, you want to make sure that you're benign as possible in your approach and your application to make sure that that information that you're getting is good data. You know, if you attack the animal to put your tag on, and then all it does is swim away, swim around trying to get away from you for the next 20 hours, it's not really going to tell you much about what the animals do. And because tag data always has a small sample size, that's always something we have to be really concerned about. So if we have a tag that's on for 20 hours, that's still a sample size of 1 because it's on just one animal. So we're always challenged by this problem of sample size. So here's the D tag cruising along in the back of the animal, again attached with suction cups. We do have to retrieve it at the end of this time to get the data back. This is some of the data from this past summer where we tagged animals in sanctuary. We tagged 15 animals for about 100 hours of data. These dots that you're seeing are the surfacings during the daytime when we could actually follow the animals. So we're not only having the tag on the animal, we're doing focal animal follows with behavioral sequencing and also doing prey mapping during this time as well. So there's a lot going on because there's a lot going on in the animal's lives. But this gives you an idea of the attachment durations. The shortest one here is 1 hour and 24 minutes, and the longest one is 22 hours. So that gives you an idea. Because they're suction cups, they get knocked off. You know, the animals roll up against each other, or sometimes even roll around on the bottom and dislodge them. That can be frustrating because although that little video clip makes it look like you can just drive up next to them and pop the tag on, of course, if I was going to show you the video of us not getting tags on, it would be pretty boring and it would go on forever. So this is a simple time depth record of some of the tagged animals. This is time along the bottom, and I'll caution you, these are all different size clips. So this one goes from 8 a.m. to about 1 a.m. This one is a little bit longer. This one is only going from 1800 to 2200. So they don't all line up. But the key here is there's a couple interesting things going on. Time depth recorders, of course, are just telling you where in the water column the animal is at a particular time. So you can see there's all sorts of stuff going on somewhere here. And then you hit this red line, and about an hour after that, we get this very homogeneous activity. Similar here, here's that red line again, and that red line is really sunset or civil twilight. So here's that red line again, and then we get this interesting similar behavior. Here it is occurred a little before twilight, and this was actually lucky for us, and I'll get into that in a second. But an hour after, it starts again just before the tag comes off. Same thing here, civil twilight, gets dark, and we get this behavior again and again. So the question becomes, what are those nighttime behaviors, and where in the water column are they occurring? Or do humpback whales feed along the bottom? One of the interesting things about humpback whales is despite the fact we know all sorts of things about their social structure, people have been really studying humpback whales for a very long time. We know lots about them. We know almost nothing about how they feed. Their foraging behavior is a mystery. Their underwater behavior is almost completely unknown, despite the fact that we know all sorts of things about them genetically, where they go seasonally. All the animals have names, as you guys probably know, and you know how often they've had calves. There's a huge amount of information about this species. We know almost nothing about what they do underwater. So one of the people on our team, Colin Ware, we've got the D tag that creates huge amounts of data. But the problem always is then how to make sense of that data, and particularly how to visualize those data so it makes sense to the rest of the world and not just the scientific community. Because if you're going to work in the policy context the way we do at the sanctuary, you have to make sure that everybody can understand what you're talking about in a fairly convenient way. So Colin Ware at the University of New Hampshire developed this particular way to visualize data for us. He's one of our teams, and as we were working out there, he said, we need a better way to look at these data. And he invented this little program while he was on the boat that he calls Track Plotter. Basically, what you're seeing here is the path of an animal. The ribbon is the path that the animal's taking through the water column in 3D. And you'll see we can actually make this into 4D by incorporating a time element into it. But for now, we'll just look at it like this. Here's the whale right there. Now, in track plot, that whale is right there at that particular time, 15:29:51. And at that time and location, that's the depth that it's at. So this is a great way of letting us look at what's going on underwater fairly quickly. Yes, that's a single whale. So that ribbon track is just the path that whale is swimming underwater. That is only a couple of minutes right there. This is coming from a surface. The animal's moving along the surface. It's making a dive. It's coming around here. And actually, you guys have seen National Geographic. You've probably seen whales yourself. This is a bubble net. You're wondering what a humpback whale looks like when it's blowing a bubble net underwater. Well, this is what they look like. So the animal's going to be doing these concentrically smaller rings. Come up. I'll show you this in a bit better. But this is one dive sequence that you're looking at right here. So now, the great thing about Track Plotter is that I can now go back to my time depth record and say, what is going on right here? Let's say at 22:30 or so, this is what the animal's doing. So I can go into Track Plotter, and here at 22:34:46, this is what that animal is doing. It's down 31.7 meters, and here you are, a little bit over 30 meters, so about 32 meters. That seems to line up. And the animal's down there along the bottom, on its side, rolled down its side, head tipped, body oriented down a little bit, moving right along the bottom. And it's going to be doing this over and over again. So this entire period here, this is the whale. Everything in this direction is back here. Everything that you're looking at out here is in here. So this animal is going to the bottom and then turning onto its side and moving right along the bottom. And it just so happens that all of these animals are doing the same thing. So here's the civil twilight time, right about 21:24:54. Animal's down around 30 meters. So there it is, down around 30 meters. And it is now looking out here at all this stuff here. Okay, so that's its future. And you can see it's just going down to the bottom this entire time, moving along the bottom on its side, orienting itself, moving along the bottom on its side again. Now, there's other ways to look at it. Colin Ware also has invented a program that some of you might be familiar with called GeoZooey. It was GeoZooey 3D, and now that he's been working with us, he's turned it into GeoZooey 4D. But basically what it does is it takes all those data from the D-tag and creates a virtual whale that will then swim to the tag data. Now, the real power of GeoZooey is not only the fact that it will create a virtual whale that swims just like your real whale, but you can then take other data sets and join them into the GeoZooey program and see how they work together. So the blue here is bathymetry from NOAA charts. So we've taken that and blindly joined the swim track from the D-tag with the bathymetry from NOAA. And you can see the animals going right down to the bottom. This is a rigid model. The flippers wouldn't really be sticking out there like that. But so it's going down to the bottom and just over and over making these rolls onto the side, head oriented down a little bit. It's, again, a very powerful way of looking at what animals are doing down, in this case, about 100 meters. Now, the nice thing about the D-tag, though, is that I've been showing you things without sound, but the D-tag, of course, is collecting sound while all this is going on. So we can even look at this in terms of what's going on acoustically as well. So let's see if there's actually any sound here. Okay, so that's the tag breaking water as the animal's diving. Now, the other one I had sped up. This one, unfortunately, is in real time, because if you speed it up, then you mess up the acoustics as well. So it'll take a little bit longer. But you can see all the past dives, the lines in the background. The blue is the dive that it's on now. And so, in the interesting things, you can see the animals just free glide to the bottom. They take a couple of strokes with their flukes and then just glide to the bottom, very efficient in terms of energy usage. And what seems to be happening, of course, is that the animals go deeper, their lungs collapse, they get denser, and they're just going to ride that right down to the bottom. Can't hear that too well. Can you hear that clunking? Well, that's the animal. And this is something that one of my PhD students, Alison Stimpert at the University of Hawaii, is working on. We're calling them paired bursts. These are sounds the animals seem to make prior to turning onto their sides. So we're not really sure what's going on. We thought maybe they were doing this to scare sand lance out of the bottom. I'll show you some pictures of that in a second. So we went up to the New England Aquarium, where luckily they had just gotten some sand lance in, and they were actually keeping them in captivity. So we went up there and created this great experiment. We're going to play these sounds to the sand lance and see them like start hurrying around and scattering. And of course, we played the sounds to them, and absolutely nothing happened at all. So who knows? It's always tough to try to do experiments on animals in captivity and apply that to animals in the wild. But in that case, it didn't work. Here's one of the possible things that might be happening. These are sand lance here on the bottom, and sand lance will bury themselves into the substrate at night. And here we are with an ROV. This is from the University of Connecticut, Peter Oster's group, and they're flying that ROV along the bottom, and as the ROV moves along, the sand lance just come whipping out. So it's possible that that's what the whales are doing, is trying to force sand lance out of the bottom so they can capture them. Now what's interesting is that this is the body orientation from the D-tag in GeoZooey, and these are scuffs along the animals' faces in real life. So they're lining up where the D-tag and the visualization would predict you'd have contact at the bottom, is right where the animals have these scuffings that, again, leads you to believe that that may be what's happening. The nice thing about the sanctuary is that we have really good multi-beam bathymetry, so we can look at what the substrate type is where these animals are doing these behaviors. Now, unfortunately, most of the time it's happening at night. And at night, we do not have good georeference positions because we can't see the animal. During the day, we're following with these nice high-tech Leica laser range-finding binoculars, and every time the animals come to the surface or dive, we're getting a latitude and longitude from them. But we can't do that at night. So when I talked earlier, I said here's an animal that actually started doing this behavior before sundown, and that was lucky for us because this is the animal that was doing that. So because we have these red balls here where we actually have a latitude and longitude position for the animal, and then we can take that with the multi-beam bathymetry, which lets you identify sediments because of the backscatter information. And here we're seeing gravel in gray, sand in kind of the tannish, and mud in brown. And you see the animals are mostly working in these sandy areas. So again, just kind of leads us to believe that they're really foraging at night along the bottom on sand lance. Of course, when we put down an ROV, we couldn't find any sand lance when we did this. So maybe they'd eaten them all. Just goes to tell you that the whales are really better at this stuff than we are. This is about a 4-hour period in the life of this particular animal. This was in the Great South Channel, out in Stellwagen. This is an animal we tagged in 2005, but it gives you an idea. Again, the ribbon track, the path of the animal, surface behaviors up here, then animals diving and moving along the bottom. These little polygons that you're seeing are actually fluke strokes. Using the D-tag, you can actually tease out fluke strokes from the animal. So you're seeing the up and down motion of the animals are moving through the water column. And you can see quite nicely here that there's a couple of fluke strokes in the beginning, and then they just coast right down to the bottom. And they do that over and over again. On the way up, as you might imagine, they're negatively buoyant, so they have to fluke on the way up. And then once they get to a certain point, then they just free glide the rest of the way because they're becoming more and more buoyant as they hit the surface. One of the interesting things here, these are, again, the folds in the ribbon track are the side rolls. So you can see all the side rolls here. The two dominant positions, body positions, are 0, 0, which is your normal dorsal ventral swimming behavior. And then over here, rolled about 90 to 100 degrees and pitched down about 30 degrees. So this is that body orientation right there. But if you look at all these different folds, they're all traveling the same direction. So that's really interesting, the same compass heading. So we had speculated that maybe there are sand ridges down there that the animals are working along, foraging along these ridges. And that was one of the reasons we put down the ROV, and it was totally flat, featureless bottom. So another great idea destroyed by a horrible fact. But something's going on. Maybe currents, they may be foraging cross currents. We don't really know. We did not get good current data when we were out there, unfortunately. So there's all sorts of things. Every time you think you're adding a lot of good pieces of data collection, you find that the one that you really needed is not the one that you have. Gets pretty complicated, as you might guess. This just shows you for this period of time what the median side roll duration was, so about 17 seconds. So they're going down there, rolling on their sides for about 17 seconds, orienting themselves dorsal-ventrally again, and then using maybe a 17-second side roll again. That's one whale. Yeah, that's one whale. Right on the bottom. Yep. Now, on Stellwagen in 2006, we found this behavior only at night. In the Great South Channel in 2005, they did it 24 hours a day. Every tagged animal did this. So again, there's a lot of variation in how they behave, given the context that they're working in at the time. Usually 4 to 6 minutes dive duration. So not real long. Well, that's one of the unknowns. We believe it's sand lance. During the summer of 2006, we saw a lot of sand lance behavior on the surface. So we know that they're feeding on sand lance during the day on the surface. And then we're speculating that they're also feeding on sand lance at night along the bottom.
Okay,
sand lance are known to migrate into the substrate at night. So it all makes sense, but we haven't actually been able to get an ROV down there that says, oh yeah, look at all the sand lance down here coming out of the bottom while the whales are doing it. Back to the policy orientation of this, it was very helpful to have these kind of data when the National Marine Fisheries Service, in this case the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries and International Fund for Animal Welfare, created a buyback program for the Massachusetts lobster industry. So you could go and turn in your floating gear and get a voucher for buying sinking gear. So that way the fishermen didn't have to deal with the entire financial burden of shifting over their gear for whales, because certainly it isn't only their burden to shoulder. So I think there's a good example of a lot of different agencies coming together to help solve a problem. But they took out about 2,100 miles of floating line, giving you an idea of how much is down there. Huge amounts of line in the water column. So then the question is, how do they feed? How do they use the surface, or when they're surface feeding, what are they doing underwater? This is from Bill Lang's work with the Goodyear Fuji blimp, I guess it was. And here you can get a nice look at an animal blowing one of these bubble nets starting out here, and you can see it kind of getting concentrically smaller circles as the animal's moving. And of course, that's exactly what we're seeing here with the DTAG data. Yeah, well, there it was. So this animal is in this portion right now, but this is where all the blowing is. And again, the nice thing about using the DTAG is we can hear the animal blowing bubbles through this entire time. Let's see what this is. Okay, I haven't really done the track plotter program justice, because you can fly the track plotter in real time. I've been showing you static images of it, but when you're actually using it, you can move right along that track at any speed that you want to, and you can even change the orientation. So you can look at it from a bird's eye view, from a side view. So here you're seeing an animal that was on the surface. It's now going to dive. When you see it making a kind of a tilting, that's when it's fluking. Okay, a rigid model. So the animal's beginning to blow bubbles now.
What's the yellow color?
The yellow color is a roll of greater than 40 degrees. I should have mentioned that earlier. So when the animal is rolling greater than 40 degrees, we color-coded it yellow just so we could pick them out easier. So you can see as that ring is getting tighter, the animal is going to have to start rolling as well as circling. So now it's coming up, and now it's going to take its tail flukes and slam them down onto the surface, creating a surface disturbance in the middle of the bubble net, and then quickly comes up and lunges through there with its mouth open, grabbing what's ever there. So this is looking again. These animals are all surface feeding, and this is the bottom profile in pink. So one of the questions we had for entanglement is, if the animals are on the surface doing the surface feeding, are they also vulnerable to gear that's on the bottom? And you can see some of the times they're actually just going right down to the bottom, even though most of the activity is on the surface. This is where this particular tagged animal was on Stellwagen Bank, southwest corner. And this is a close-up look of that area where it's working right along the drop-off between about 20 to 100 meters, or 60 meters right there. So for instance, with track plotter, I might want to know what's going on right here. Evidently, he's down at the bottom at 11:57:58. And so we tossed track plotter on it. Here it is at 11:58:11, down 49 meters. So there he is, about down 49 meters. And here he is cruising along the bottom, heading over to do all this surface feeding, which is this stuff that you're seeing right here. So even though you might be seeing something like this on the surface, it doesn't mean that the animal wasn't down at the bottom just, less than a minute prior to that. Now this is looking at it from a bird's eye view. Again, you can switch this program around to look any perspective that you want. So here the animal's coming into this area at 10:58. So here is 10:58. So this time from here to here is all this activity from here, 10:58 up there, 11:27 down here, 11:43 where he's coming out. So from here to here. So you can see not only is there a lot of activity vertically, but there's a lot of activity horizontally. So we've been talking about mostly the gear that's along the bottom being a hazard to the animals, but also the gear that's going to the bottom to the surface is a hazard, because imagine these animals just twisting and turning and rolling through that whole area. So both the vertical and the horizontal lines are going to be an entanglement risk for the critters. There we go. This just gives you an idea of bubbles. This is an animal in Hawaii. Dave Matilla, a friend of mine, gave me this footage. But you can see the animal blowing bubbles. This is what they're doing in this section. Okay, and that really is, our animals aren't going quite as quickly, so it's a tighter bubble net. You can see that makes an effective barrier to fish. So these guys are coming down here, blowing, in this case, just a single circle of bubbles. Then they're taking their tail flukes, slapping it down onto the surface right there, and then ducking down and coming up right in that spot with their mouths open. And, oh, there's the whale over there. And grabbing food. Let's see. Now, of course, one of the things that we want to try to do eventually is to be, come on. Yeah, let me try that at the end. Remind me to try to play that at the end, because it does work. Oh, wait a second. Did it work now? Okay, there we go. So in this case, we had an EK60 looking at the prey along in the water column as we were following the tagged animals. That was one of the tagging vessels. This is one of the whales that's tagged. And that ribbon that you're seeing in color is measuring the concentration of fish in the water. Yellow being high concentrations, red less, and blue being, they go pretty fast. But you can see there's a lot of prey right along the surface in this particular area. Now, we had two animals tagged. We didn't tag them together, but they ended up coming together. You can see this big group of sand lance just over to the side. Now, the nice thing, all this stuff is spatially correct. So the whales are in scale. The distance between them, therefore, is correct. So this animal, you can hear him blowing bubbles, I think, if I'm quiet. I don't know if you guys can hear that kind of blah, 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 blah. So that's the animal blowing bubbles. Again, that other animal was tagged separate from this animal, but decided to come over and kind of raid this guy's efforts. Okay, so there's that tail slam. This guy's heading over now. I'm going to beat the other guy to the surface. So again, this is what we're trying to move towards. Wow, really loud there. Because really to understand these behaviors, you have to understand the prey available to the animals in the same place and time. And one of the problems we had here is the EK-60 was on a 180-foot boat, the research vessel Nancy Foster, the NOAA research vessel. So of course we couldn't get very close to the animals in real time and space. We tried to put it on a small inflatable, and then we couldn't keep up with the whales. So we need something in between those two sizes to really do a good job of measuring the water column. Mark Baumgartner here at Hui is probably doing the best work of anybody in the world right now of trying to look at prey patches and foraging behavior and make the correlations between the two of them. So anyway. So as you might guess, there's a lot of people that have to go into a project such as this. So I'll just quickly point out what all the different people do. These are our two photo ID experts from the Whale Center of New England. And these two women can look at a whale's dorsal fin from 2 miles away and tell you who it is, when it was born, how many calves it's had. Really amazing wealth of information. And for us, it's really key to be able to track the animals. Because although the D-tag does have a VHF recorder on it, so when it comes to the surface, we can directionalize. If there's 10 or 15 animals in that area, you know, you can't have a hard time figuring out where that beep is actually coming from. And these women can just go, oh, you know, that's such and such an animal, that's Ursa, that's animal A, that's animal B, and it's incredibly powerful. And of course, they're extremely good at behavioral sequencing, writing down everything that the animal does at the second that it takes place, because they've been doing it for many years. This is Mike Thompson. A lot of the cool mapping that you're seeing is done by him. He's in my lab. This is one of the NOAA people that make sure that we're paying attention to our permit and assorted things like this. This is Colin Ware from University of New Hampshire, who designs all these great programs. This is Tom Hurst from Hui, who's one of the engineers and also often is putting the tag on with the pole. Roland Arsenal is the person who's really the lead designer now for GeoZooey. This is one of the people that I can never remember what he does, actually. A couple of these guys are PhD candidates from Duke. This is Allison Stimpert, PhD candidate at University of Hawaii, and assorted other people here. So you can see it's a big team. When we're out there, we're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it requires a lot of people because there's a lot of different things that are happening simultaneously. And luckily, we all get along really well. Now, the reason this is important from a sanctuary standpoint is this is some work done by IEC, which is a research industrial group up in industrial economics. That's what it is, industrial economics. And what they did is they looked at where fishing activity, fixed gear fishing activity, occurs along the coast of the United States, eastern seaboard. And the Stellwagen Sanctuary is right here. So you can see that we're really in the heaviest part of fishing activity along the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. So we really have to come to grips with what's happening. We either have to come up with ways to allow fishing and whales to co-occur, or one or the other is going to have a real problem. And right now, we're really working hard to find ways for them to co-occur. Let's see, I don't think we need to look at that one. That was to introduce some of the work we're doing on shipping, because we've been mostly talking about entanglement, but of course the D-tag is great for looking at interactions with vessels, and there's a lot of issues in the sanctuary with vessels, as you might guess just from pictures such as this. These red dots aren't entanglements. This is where whales have been recorded as colliding with ships. And you can see there's a lot of red dots right up here, which is where our sanctuary is. Now, this isn't surprising because there's a lot of whales, and there's also a lot of vessel traffic. Now, just like with the fishing gear, if you want to try to figure out how to mitigate this, one of the best ideas is to know where vessels are and where whales are, and again, look for co-occurrence and ways to reduce co-occurrence. This is coming from AIS data. The height of the histogram and the color is density. So you can see there's a great deal of activity right through this area, and those are the shipping lanes that go through the sanctuary. So although you can see that there's vessel traffic just about everywhere, the vast majority of it is coming through one particular section, which are the commercial shipping lanes. That's one of Mike Thompson's maps. This is another one of Mike's maps. So we know where the ships are. Now we have to figure out where the whales are. And what you're looking at here, the years you'll notice are kind of clicking by down there in the corner. There we go. The map is gridded into 1 nautical mile cells with density color-coded. So it's a quintile analysis. The top 20% are in the darkest colors. The bottom 20% are in the lightest colors. And you can get an idea, though there's a lot of interannual variability. If you look at that over 20 years, you can see there's a real pattern here as to where the whales tend to occur and not occur. And when we looked at this, we said, now that might be an interesting place to move boats to, because there's not whales there. Then it's not as much of a big issue if there are boats there. So basically the idea, this is the same data created a little bit differently, red being high density areas, blue being low density areas, the shipping lane, this strip going across. You can see the current shipping lane goes through a lot of the red zone. The idea would be to move it, hit the wrong one again, sorry. Scary. There's too many slides left. I'll go fast. Okay. The idea is to shift it up into that area, into the areas where there's fewer whales. So if we do a quick little analysis, these dots are sightings, and this is the traffic lane. And if we look at how many of those sightings over the 20-some years, there are about 62,000 sightings of different species of baleen whales that occurred in the traffic lanes. If we move the traffic lanes up to that area, there's only about 12,000 sightings up in that area. So there seems to be a real reason, or at least we suspected there was going to be some conservation value in making that shift. Just a little summary. About an 81% reduction in the number of sightings in that area. Now then we wanted to know, because that is using whale watch data from the Center for Coastal Studies and the Whale Center of New England, it can't be effort corrected. So it's kind of makes you really leery about using data that can't be effort corrected, because you don't really know if the data are real or not. And maybe that's just where the whale watching boats go, and there's lots of whales in the other areas, they're just not being recorded. So that's a real issue, particularly if you're going to do something like a major international move of shipping lanes, which requires a huge rigmarole. So we wanted to look for things that would give us confidence that maybe that those data were real. So because we had the great multi-beam bathymetry data, we decided to look at the current traffic separation scheme relative to the bottom types. So here, brown is going to be mud, tan is sand, and gray is gravel. Sandlance, remember, occur over sandy habitats, and that's where fin whales, minke whales, and humpback whales, that's what they eat, not right whales. We'll have to leave those guys off for a second. But the current traffic separation scheme, about 48% of the bottom that it covers is sand. If we move it, only about 16% of the bottom that it covers is sand. There seems to be an ecological reason that we'd have confidence in that there are fewer whales in the areas that they're not going to be feeding it. This is kind of the same data looked at a little bit differently. Histogram heights are the number of whales. The color is the substrate. And you can see that we've got a lot of whales in here and a lot of sand. The purple is the traffic separation scheme width. And if we make that move, we're going to shoot that gap, and we not only have fewer whales, but it goes to being mostly mud and mostly gravel. Again, less preferred habitat types for the forage fish. So again, it seemed like we had some good ecological reasons, but what about right whales? This doesn't fit for right whales because they're not feeding on sandlance, although sandlance feed on copepods, which is what right whales feed on. So if we look at the same type of kriging just for right whales, there are about 915 sightings of right whales in the current traffic separation scheme, and about 385, or 58%, less sightings in the moved traffic lane. Now, is there anything that we can try to look at that gives us confidence that those data might actually be real ecologically. And Meng Zhao, who's a modeler up at UMass Boston, took neutrally buoyant particles and scattered them through Massachusetts Bay. And then he used his model to work on them for about a month. And he found that in some years, most of them concentrated down here in Cape Cod Bay, which is, of course, where Stormy Mayo and his people find lots and lots of right whales. But in other years, some of them started concentrating up here north of Provincetown and in the area of the current traffic separation scheme, which is the shipping lanes. So you can see that red dotted areas where we're going to try to move it to, and you can see that gets it out of that area where the modelers predicted that neutrally buoyant particles as a proxy for copepods would tend to accumulate. So again, it seemed like there was an ecological relationship there that we might be exploiting with the traffic separation move. This is a right whale that Mark Baumgartner and I tagged 2 years ago, and it just to me brought home the point of why it's important to move the traffic separation scheme or the shipping lanes instead of just putting people up to look for the whales to miss them. This is a mother and calf. We tagged the mother, and Mark again is one of the best people for mapping prey and looking at how whales respond to prey. But here we have the prey in red and high density being red and yellow and low density being blue, and the whale is diving down into these high density areas. This is right along the thermocline, only down maybe 20 meters or so. And you can see the animals routinely diving into that area. Now, if you look at where the draft for some of the largest ships are, that animal is being exposed to ship traffic almost continuously, but yet she's on the surface very small periods of time. So if you're just going to look for that whale and try to miss her, you're not going to have much luck. So therefore, we believe we've got to separate them in space and time to really get much of a conservation improvement. And this is just a summary slide. Right whales, white dots, all of the baleen whales creeked red to yellow to blue, and you can see moving the traffic separation scheme is going to really shoot that gap and give us a fair conservation benefit. And actually, we did succeed in doing this. It was a very long process. After we went through the data, then we had to go and convince NOAA to do it. Then NOAA had to go and convince the rest of the agencies that have to do with maritime industry and the ocean to do it. Then we had to go into the UN and to the International Maritime Organization to do it. But starting July 1st of this year, those ships are going to be coming through that little trough of whale sightings that we think will buy us some pretty good reduction in risk. I'm just going to start going quick because we've been here. Where'd the clock go? I think we've been here a bit of time. But of course, we're also worried because for white whales in particular, the Whale Watcher database is not terribly robust because right whales are in our area from January through May. Whale watching, where most of those data were derived from, really works from mid-April until mid-October. So we're missing really the peak of the right whale time. So we certainly didn't want to move things into an area that was good for humpback whales and fin whales, even though they're endangered as well, and bad for right whales. So what we did is we took these pop-up buoys. These are acoustic recording buoys invented by Chris Clark at Cornell University, one of our collaborators, and we placed them throughout the sanctuary. And those were sitting down there for 3 months at a time for a year. And the idea is that they're collecting all sorts of whale sounds and shipping sounds that we could then look and see where whales tended to occur, right whales in particular. This is some analysis being done by Sophie Van Paris at the Marine Fisheries Service down the street here. And what we found, these dots are where the buoys were. These numbers are the number of calls that were recorded on those buoys in the month of January 2006. And then here we have how many right whales were sighted in January 2006. So there was one right whale sighted on one day in the sanctuary in January 2006. But you can see there's right whale calls all through the sanctuary throughout that entire month. So sighting data was not really giving us anywhere near representative sample of what right whales are doing in the sanctuary. So that was in January. In February, no sightings of right whales in the sanctuary, but yet right whale calls almost every day. And in March, 3 sightings of right whales in the sanctuary, but calls, lots of calls almost every day. And also, when we looked at this in terms of the shipping lanes, you can see lots of calls going down, lots of calls going down, going down. So the data seem to really lend support that the move that we were proposing and have now finalized is actually really going to help right whales as well. But you can see you have to attack this from a lot of different angles because there's just a lot going on that you don't know about. This is just kind of one of the cool things that Sophie found. This is the number of calls over the period of hours of a day, so 1 to 24 hours. And there's this big peak of calls right here around dusk. And this is where the right whales seem to get together to vocalize and socialize. When I was tagging right whales in Cape Cod Bay, I couldn't keep a suction cup tag on an animal after dark. They just always come to the surface. And the last thing we'd see was usually the animal that we had been following all day was suddenly there's other animals coming towards it. It would get dark and the tag would pop off. But it seems that this is the time that they socialize, so it makes sense that they would be rubbing against each other and knocking off those little suction cup tags. So again, after years of speculating, we're getting more information from data we had from the late 1990s. What's this? Yeah, one of the nice things about this project is we are attacking things from all sorts of different directions. These are the locations of the pop-up buoys recording whale sounds. These are the locations of detagged animals that are recording sounds that whales are actually making. So now we can look at this and see how many sounds the whales are making as recorded by the detag that are and are not being picked up by our acoustic buoys. So again, it gives us an idea, a way of understanding the strength and the limitations of this particular technology. This is looking at just sound coming from the shipping lanes. This is sound recorded by the buoys over a 24-hour period from about 5 to 1,000 hertz. And this is the range that whales really use acoustically. So you can see there's a great deal of noise, almost chronic noise of the course of 24 hours coming from mostly shipping that is right in the very band that whales are going to be using. So one of the reasons that we think that acoustics is going to be an issue that we have to try to deal with. This is done by one of our collaborators at Cornell University from our data. And what you're going to see here is this is actually an animation of sound. dB's over here. So if you see it dark blue, it's around 100 dB, which is just about ambient sound for a clear day out in the sanctuary. And then the sounds get higher and higher up to about 160 dB in the red. So now, because we can track vessels, I didn't even talk about this too much, but we have a system. There's a system now called AIS that the Coast Guard uses to track vessels. There's a transponder on a vessel, and if you have receivers, you can track vessels in real time. So we have 3 receivers through the sanctuary, so we can map in real time all vessel traffic. Here comes an LNG tanker through the sanctuary. You can see it's now just blasting 130 dB or louder throughout the entire, this is 186 square miles, about 27% of the sanctuary. So that boat goes through there and just lights up the entire sanctuary acoustically. And of course, that's happening on a regular basis. Last one I'll leave you with. One of the things that we're also quite well known for is whale watching. I suspect some of you have been on whale watching trips. And one of the issues, of course, is whale watching good or bad for whales? It's something that we really can't answer. But because we were all concerned, both policymakers, scientists, whale watch naturalists, and the whale watch operators themselves, we got together back in the late 1990s after a number of whales had been hit by whale watching boats, and we developed this series of guidelines that whale watching boats were going to adhere to try to reduce the risk of their operations on whales. So we decided after some period of time that we should probably monitor this and see if they were actually following these guidelines, if that's what was supposed to be keeping the whales safe. So what we did is we put observers, we didn't really tell them we were doing this, we put observers on the boat with a GPS in their backpack so we could track the movement and speed of the vessels. And then we had these nice laser range-finding binoculars that if you could acquire the whale would tell you the latitude and longitude that the whale was at. So here you're seeing that. There's the GPS. This is the recorder. They're using their binoculars to locate this whale, and now you can put a latitude and longitude on that whale. Well, these are the guidelines. Starting at 2 miles from the whale, you're supposed to slow down to 13 knots. These are boats that are going, usually around 20 to 30 knots. You're supposed to slow down to 13 knots. Within a mile to a half mile, it's supposed to slow down to 10 knots. Within a half mile, is supposed to slow down to 7 knots. So because now we can locate the whale in time and space, and we've got the track of the vessel, and we know how large those rings are supposed to be, we can look at the monitoring. So here, this outer ring is the 2-mile area. This is the 1-mile area. This is the half-mile area. So over here, if you're going greater than 13 knots, we're going to color code the track red. If it's 10 to 13 knots, it's going to be orange, 7 to 10 light green, and less than 7 dark green. So basically, everything in here is supposed to be orange or less, light green, dark green. So you're not supposed to see any red anywhere in these things. And only dark green is supposed to be in here, if that helps you interpret these figures. So this is looking, we monitored 46 trips, all 12 companies, about 4 trips a company. And what we found is that these are the company letters, A, B, C through L, okay, for 12 of them. And then this is how often they were in compliance. Okay, so the best were above around 70% here. Most of them were in the 80 to 90% non-compliance. The zones, the closest zone to the whales, non-compliance was about 62%. And up in the other outer zones, non-compliance is up around 90, above 90%. If we look at speed, what we did is we took that track record and we looked at the fastest speed the boat could go throughout the entire trip outside of the speed zones. And then for each speed zone, we looked at what was the fastest mark that we had inside the zone. So if you have a 7-knot speed limit, you should not have any marks higher than 7 knots, of course. Same thing with the 13. So here we have, for each of these companies, what the dark dot is the fastest speed that we recorded anywhere in their trip. And then the square is the fastest speed we recorded in Zone 1. This triangle, fastest speed in Zone 2. And this triangle is fastest speed in Zone 3. And this is what they're supposed to do in those zones. So basically, they're going as fast as they can in all of the zones. This is just another way of looking at the same thing. This is per trip, so we have 40-some trips here. In red is the maximum trip speed, and then in blue is the maximum speed recorded just in that Zone 1, which is the 7-knot. So everything should be down here for Zone 1. And there's not too much difference for most of them between as fast as they can go and what they actually do go. So anyway, I think that's probably enough for now. You guys have any questions? Yeah?
Why don't they have the fishing boat, emitting some sound and tracking the whale?
That's a really good question, because the same thing could work with the traffic, the vessel traffic. If you put a sound out there that would make the whales, flush the whales away, it would seem to be a pretty good solution. The problem is, for both the fishing, particular fishing, is that fishermen and whales have a tendency to hang out in the same place for the same reason. You know, the ocean is really not a homogeneous place. You know, the resources, the food, is really patchily distributed. So the whales have to be where the food is. The fishermen, of course, also have to be where the food is. So if you scare the whales away from where the food is so the fishermen can fish there, the whales will go out of business, just like if you made the fishermen leave that area, the fishermen would go out of business. So you really can't do that and do anything good for the whales anyway. So that would be the concern about that. Similarly, if you're going to have vessels with these acoustic deterrents on them, if they're going through these areas that the whales need to forage in, need to survive, and you're always flushing them out of there, you know, it's not going to really be a good conservation measure. What we also found out, and this is Doug Nowacek's work, who was also was at Hui when he did this, now he's at University of Florida, but there are sounds that you can make that right whales don't like, and it'll cause them to start and move away. But what they found is that, what Doug found, is that when they hear that sound that they don't like, they head for the surface. They'll go from wherever they are in the water column up to the surface, but they won't hit the surface. They'll hang out maybe 5 or 6, 10 meters below the surface because that's actually because of some physics that's quieter there than other places in the water column. So they go to a place that's quieter for them, but yet it's right within the ship strike zone. So sometimes things that seem like they'd be a great idea don't, which is why if you're going to try to do conservation, you really have to look at things pretty thoroughly before you try to make a move, because seemingly that would be the perfect solution.
The second question is the suction cup. How do you press it on the whale? I mean, just the gravity?
Just the gravity. The force of that cantilevered pole coming down on the top is enough to stick it on. I used to do it with just a pole like this. You know, I'd have a little suction cup tag on the end of a pole like this, a little bit longer, and we just come up and just go like that and pop it on them. It's nice to be a little further away. Absolutely. There isn't. I mean, we put a regulation on ourselves. You know, when we're tagging, you know, we have the prop guard on because we think it's a concern. But the whale watching boats don't have them. Big ships don't have them. They say that it's less efficient. You know, that they lose efficiency. Now, one of the nice things in terms of sound is that a lot of the sound that's created is actually inefficiency. So if we're trying to quiet boats so that you don't have that huge blast of sound everywhere, making them more efficient is likely to quiet them as well. Now, what that does to the ship strike end of things is hard to say, though. We've had two animals now almost run over that we had the D-tag on. So now we can actually listen to what the whales are hearing coming from the boats and look at what the whales are doing. We haven't really gone through a really final analysis of this, but in listening just with headphones, you can barely hear that boat that's coming down on the whales. And the reason, because here we are saying about all the noise these boats make, so this is counterintuitive. But what seems to be happening, and some of the people that are now doing the physics of this are showing that it's true, is that most of the sound is coming from cavitation from the propeller that's in the back. So you get this huge screen from the body of the boat, this 800-foot boat, that forms this nice cone of silence right in the path of that vessel that the vessel's traveling in. So kind of a very difficult situation for the whales. Because we watched these two whales sleeping right in front of this boat as it was just bearing down upon them, missed them by about 100 meters. When the boat went by them, all of a sudden they both dove straight to the bottom and came up in simultaneous breaches. But yet when we listened to it, the sound had already started to fade away when they breached. So again, there's things going on there that we just don't get. Yeah?
How severe are some of the, I know some of them are fatal, but pretty severe
Boat strikes of over 12 knots are fatal about 50% of the time. Faster boats, anything over 20 knots is almost always fatal. So, and of course, the whole move in the marine industry is towards bigger, faster boats because the economics of scale says that's the place to be. So it's a real issue. You know, right now, in the terrestrial environment, more animals are killed every year by cars and by collisions with vehicles than are shot by hunters. Yeah. I don't think it attracts whales, but one of the things that we're thinking is happening is that, and this is not an attraction at all, but I was working with Bill Lang, who some of you guys may know here, right? And Bill had this great deal with the Fuji blimp company, and he called me up and he said, hey, you know, we can get a blimp. You know, what do you want to do? And I said, whoa, let me call you back in 5 minutes. And so I called him back 5 minutes. I said, here's a great thing that we can do. You know, because I had access to the Coast Guard's Homeland Security database, so I knew when vessels were coming through the traffic lanes. I also knew from having worked with the shippers that they actually must keep an exact schedule, because if they don't keep an exact schedule, they lose huge amounts of money. So I said, this is great, Bill. You know, we'll know when the vessels are coming. We'll take the blimp. We'll survey the traffic lanes for whales with the blimp. We'll count the number of whales, how they're headed, you know, what they're doing. And so we'll do that before the boat gets there. Then we'll go back. We'll hover over the boat, and we'll get that same suite of data with the boats there. We'll get a good idea of how the animals are reacting to the whales. It's long. I keep giving you guys long answers because there aren't short answers to hard questions. So what we found, first of all, is that in 2 weeks, we never got a boat. Because despite the fact that they must maintain that schedule without losing huge amounts of money, they weren't anywhere near the schedule that they were predicting. So that was the first thing we learned. The second is because now we had this great project, but no data. And last day, we decided just to head down the Great South Channel and look at whales down there. And as we got down there, here comes a boat that wasn't even supposed to be coming, but it was heading right towards us. So now we actually had what we were looking for. We had a great set of data going down without any boats. Now we're going to turn around and follow this boat on the way back. And we saw like 3 times as many animals following the boat as we did on the way down. Now, their sample size of 1 is meaningless, as everybody here knows, but it does make you curious. And it actually is consistent with things that we found from the ATOC. People found from the ATOC research where they played sound into the environment, where they saw more animals when the sound was turned on than when it was off. And Doug Nowacek's work, where animals that hear sounds they don't like head for the surface. So it seems that boats do have a tendency, possibly, to make whales more observable. Although, again, that's pretty anecdotal right now.
So when the shipping channel is moved, will you monitor that again to see if there's any movement of the animals from the previous place to the new place?
We'll keep that monitoring program on, hopefully, forever. And that'll be one of the issues. And hopefully, also, although we don't get ship strikes every year, we get one every other year or so. And hopefully we'll see that number go down. But before that becomes statistically significant, it'll be 20 years from now. But, yeah.
Now that the shipping lane has it, is it a guideline? Is it a law? Are all ships definitely going through that path? It looks like
Nope.
it's a longer path.
Well, it's a shorter path through the sanctuary. Right. It takes them longer, depending on the speed, anywhere from 7 to 18 minutes longer to go through that. So. Well, we'll find out because we have the AAS system that we can now track them all. I had all sorts of meetings with the commercial shippers about this, and basically they said, well, 7 to 18 minutes is not that big a deal. We can probably live with that because they know they've got a problem with whale strikes in a national marine sanctuary and right whales in general. But we'll find out. Now, what it is true, what they tell me, and I think is probably right, is that they have huge liability advantages by being in a recognized TSS, traffic separation scheme, shipping lane. So although they're voluntary, they would prefer to use them because if there's an accident, say if they hit a fishing boat or a recreational boat in there, well, they're the ones that have the right of way there, not the other guys. So it gives them great liability protection to be in them. And you can see the graphic that I showed you earlier where most of the vessel traffic was in the TSS. But we'll find out. We're actually hoping that even more will go in because currently the ships that come from Europe, because the TSS comes from the south, ships coming directly across from Europe don't jump into it. They just go straight across. Well, now that we've rotated it further to the north, we think that they might jump into it as well and go through that little trough area.
Also a question on the details, the data that you recorded from that. You talked about the pitch and the roll. We've always heard that combative whales tend to roll to one side.
Mm-hmm.
And they're left-handed or right-handed whales can have a straight on one side or not.
Yep.
Did you find that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Most of them are right.
9%?
Yeah, we haven't run the data, but almost all, it's very consistent. And when the behavioral sequencing folks from Whale Center of New England or Center for Coastal Studies say that an animal is left-handed or right-handed, we can go back and go, oh yeah, hey, that animal is left-handed. So it's very stereotyped and seems to work quite well.
Female are more left-handed, right?
I haven't gotten that far. I haven't heard that.
Great speech.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. And you guys are a great audience. Makes it much more fun.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. We'll do it again sometime.
Please help yourself to more cookies if there are any left. Don't take them home if you lose them. I'm so excited.
Oh, sure.